when you get up in the morning than you are when you go to bed at night, right? Because during the day, those discs compress a little bit, and it might only be a titchy bit, but it's quite an interesting phenomenon when you're going through it, right? You know, you start off with a pair of trousers in the morning that sort of hit your shoe, and in the afternoon they're almost on the floor. It's quite funny. Okay, now, when we're looking at weight, however, we've got a slightly different picture. We still have the overall S-curve for weight, all right? The problem with weight is that it's so much more variable due to the person's lifestyle, okay? So if we have children, teenagers, adults who exercise a lot and have a lot of muscle and less body fat, then their weight can be relatively stable depending upon muscle mass. If we have someone who is more sedentary, then we can see these ups and downs in weight, especially once we hit the top of the S. You know, we should say, okay, from the top of the S, my weight should flatline. But is that really what happens for many adults, right? No, because some adults will put on weight when they come to college. Some will lose weight when they leave college. Some will put on more weight when they leave college if they go into a sedentary job, right? So it's really a lot more wobbly on a weight curve depending upon lifestyle. What we see when we are watching the kids go through puberty, right, is that the growth in height, the spurt in height, occurs before the spurt in weight, all right? So we grow up, the skeleton gets longer before the muscle system catches up, all right? So our peak weight velocity is several months after our peak height velocity. All right? So we might have arms and legs that spurt faster than the trunk, right? So I suddenly get these great big arms and legs before I get taller, right? Or it might go the other way around. I might suddenly get tall and then my arms and legs grow out, okay? But it's always the skeleton that grows before the adipose and the muscular system, all right? So that's an important point to note when you are watching motor skills, okay? Because often what happens is the children grow suddenly tall and their motor skills start to look a little peculiar because bone is quite heavy, and so if my arm is suddenly 2-3 inches longer and I haven't developed the muscle to be strong enough to manage this arm, then it changes the motor patterns. So let's go back to our triangle of constraints, right? If I look at my triangle and I say, okay, skeleton, changes in the length and the weight of a skeleton is an individual structural constraint. If I change the constraint, remember, it changes the interaction, and therefore we would expect a different movement pattern to emerge from that interaction. And that's what you see when you work with that age group, right? Sometimes it can be so frustrating because they actually lose a skill that they could do before, depending upon the sport that you're in. With my background in gymnastics, that happens a lot, right? Because they pick up skills quite easily and then they suddenly grow and their center of gravity has changed, and they're not strong enough, and now they can't do a skill they could do quite easily before that growth spurt, right? But even if you're watching someone throw or catch or run, that movement pattern is going to be different. It might only be subtle, right? That's why it's important to watch lots of video and get lots of practice at analyzing these skills, because the change might be subtle, but it might be enough to make them less effective or less efficient, okay? Right, so we often, particularly with teenage boys, we're like, oh my gosh, they're so clumsy, right? They knock the glass of water over that they're reaching for. Well, yeah, because the movement pattern that was initiated was based upon an arm that was 3 inches longer, right? So the hand gets to the glass before their brain was expecting it to get to the glass, and they knock the glass over. So they're not really deliberately clumsy, they just lose control of this body for a little while. So we don't just see changes in height and long bones, right? Our arms and our legs. We also get a growth spurt between our shoulders and between our hips, depending upon our sex. All right, so if I'm male and I've gone through peak height velocity, right? So go back to that velocity curve and look at the blue line. I've gone over the hump on the blue line. So my height is starting to slow down a little bit. Now we suddenly start to see a change in the breadth of their shoulders. All right, so biacromial, that bump that you can feel on the top of your shoulder here is the acromion process. So biacromial is between the acromion processes. We see a growth spurt there. Right? Their shoulders get wider, okay? And that causes, for many males, that triangle shape that we see, right? Particularly if they're relatively fit and they're not carrying too much body fat, right? Then we start to see an increase in muscle mass. So they grow up, their shoulders get wide, and then they start to build lats, chest, delts, right? The muscles to deal with this additional skeleton. Okay. Females, once they've gone over the hump on their peak height velocity, right, and they're starting to slow down their height change, undergo biiliac growth spurt. So you can feel the iliac crest on your hips, right? Those get wider. Okay. So for girls, they develop more of this hourglass shape, right? They don't do the biacromial spurt, and the boys don't do the biiliac spurt. All right, this is based upon these growth spurts are based upon the sex hormone that has started to be released from the beginning of puberty. So as the levels of either estrogen or testosterone build within the body, that drives which growth spurt I see in the individual. One of the things that you want to watch for if you're working with girls who are going through puberty or are later than puberty is this idea of this Q angle at the knee joint. So as you get more involved in reading about what happens with performances and things with girls and boys, and start reading some research, you'll see that girls have many more knee injuries than boys do. There are lots of factors that play into knee injuries, all right? One of them is this Q angle. So what happens is before puberty, if you walk along behind a girl or a boy, right, unless they've done something with their hair that uniquely identifies them as male or female, it can be hard to tell from the back whether it's a boy or a girl because they're straight, right? So then what happens is as her hips grow, the femur starts to angle into the knee and it changes the torque on the knee, right? So as I said, if you're working with girls who are either going through puberty or are post-puberty, you want to make sure that you do lots of leg strengthening on quads and hamstrings, and to keep those, to try to keep the knees as stable as possible with this angle coming in. If you look at marathon runners, top-class female marathon runners very rarely have an hourglass shape, right? They typically have very narrow hips, right? They look more male, boyish, right? Because of the number of miles you have to put in to be a top-class marathoner. If you've got a huge Q angle, you get hurt way before you can ever become that good, right? So there's some interesting kind of links between what's happening to the skeleton and the muscular system and what we see in sport performance. So all the systems have their own timelines for growing, right? Remember that we defined growth and maturation differently earlier on in the semester, right? Growth is a change in the size. Maturation is a change in the function of the system, right? So it's a qualitative change towards optimal functioning, adult functioning in the system, right? Girls mature earlier than boys, right? Some would say the boys never catch up, but not me, of course. I wouldn't say that. So they grow in size and then these systems have to mature. So it's related to, but not defined by. And all the systems, in the same way as they have their own timeline for growing, have their own timeline for maturing. Right? So children will vary a lot in maturation rate, and this can be quite difficult when you're the coach or the teacher or the PT, because they might be relatively small but be quite mature in the system, right? So they could be small in size but relatively mature in a particular system for their chronological age. And it's difficult to tell that, right? I can't infer maturity from size alone. So if I'm working with I don't know, is that middle school puberty? Is that middle school, guys? I don't know. When do you move into middle school? If you're going to work with that age group, then you could have people who are reaching sexual maturity. You could have other kids who haven't even begun their growth spurt yet, right? And you could have all those different levels of growth and maturity basically within one class. Right? So you've got to be ready to be very, very flexible with how you organize your setup in your gym or your setup for your training program. Right? We have early versus late maturers. Okay? And that, again, can be something that's important to identify, again, depending upon what you're doing, what level of competition, if it's a competition, are you at. Okay? This is going very slow today. Okay, here we go. So, as I said, girls mature earlier than boys do, and they appear at a younger age in early maturers. So we've got girls mature faster than boys. We've also got early maturers mature obviously faster than late maturers. So if I'm a girl and I'm an early maturer, I could basically have adult functioning systems in a class where there are boys who are late maturers, who are basically physiologically 9 or 10 years old, right? In the same class, okay? So we've got to be careful. As I said, we've got to be careful, all right? That's not page 71. Think about how you would counsel. Where is that? It is page 167. Right? How do you counsel the parent of the star athlete? Right? Is the star athlete in middle school? Is he still going to be the star athlete in high school or in college? Right? Because when we look at sport performance, how tall I am and how muscular I am can play a big role in how successful I am, right? It might not be that this individual is more talented, they're just bigger and stronger, and that puts them at the front, right? So, got to be a little bit careful and talk to the parents and say, well, you know, he's physiologically ahead of the game. We can't kind of plan on him being a world record holder until we know how he's going to match up when everybody else catches up with him physiologically, right? However, what's interesting when you look at the data here is that these children who are early maturers gain experience in sport skills that the other children aren't quite getting because they're better at them and they're more successful at them, right? So that gives them an edge when the other kids start catching up. Does that make sense? Yes? No? So Kayla, what age group do you want? I know you're working on your PE teacher.
Preferably high school right now, but if I was able to move to the college level, that's where I would ultimately like to be.
Okay. Okay, so hopefully you'll pass a lot of the problems of puberty, although you will still, particularly in your boys, you'll still be getting some big changes. And if you've got late maturers in your female athletes, they won't have finished growing and maturing yet in high school. So, yeah, you're going to see this firsthand. Okay? Another thing to pay attention to for your girls is that menarche follows peak height velocity by about a year. So if you're tracking their height, once they start to slow down, not stop growing, remember, we're looking at velocity. So once that velocity starts to slow down, you've got about a year to get them ready to deal with menarche. Okay? Boys don't have any kind of similar timing for the maturity of their sexual organs. Viable sperm for a boy is gradual. It's not like a girl where 1 minute she's not sexually mature and then basically the next minute she is, right? For boys it's a little bit different. There's not such a specific timeline there. Right, so maturation is also a structural constraint. So we can expect to see changes in motor patterns on skills that they can already do based upon different levels of maturation of the systems. Okay? Any questions? And we'll look at the I think chapter 9, if chapter 9 is chapter 5, we'll be looking at some of the different systems and seeing what actually goes on. Alright, so this shouldn't come as any surprise because it's a very similar concept to what we see with the fetus. Alright, when these individuals are going through rapid periods of growth, then they're more susceptible to any problems that could occur, all right, after birth and puberty. So there's an increased influence of the external, right? So if I train someone too hard when they are not skeletally mature, I can damage their skeleton, right? Now, in many instances, typically developing children will show catch-up after a particularly rough time. So let's say they got meningitis or some other disease, right? They got sick during a period of rapid growth. Then that system might slow down in response to the energy it takes to deal with being sick, right? I don't have the energy to grow this system now, right? And so I get a little bit delayed. Once I'm not sick anymore, then most children and teenagers will show this catch-up phase. So they'll suddenly go into a rapid growth maturation phase and get back onto their typical curve. All right? Depending on how severe and how long the issue was, whether it was sickness or an injury or abuse, right? Then sometimes that child, teenager, never gets back to their full potential. So we see that when we hear awful stories about kids being found locked in a cupboard, and they've been locked in a cupboard or locked in a small space for years and years and years. Often those children never fully recover physiologically, not even discussing what's going on in their brain, right, in their head and mental health. But when we look at their physiological growth, they often don't recover from a long period of abuse like that, right? If they're not fed enough, okay? So one of the problems we have when we live in a poor rural area is that we know our children are nutritionally not at where they should be, right? They're not getting enough food and they're not getting the amount of nutrients that they need because sometimes the food choices that they're being given are not very healthy, right? So if you work in an area like this, you might have children who are underdeveloped because of nutrition, right? You think about, we have many children in Roosevelt and Curry County whose only meal during the day is at school, right? And they haven't been at school for 5 months. And now they're not going back to school this week, right? So what is going to be the impact on those children when we look at their growth and maturation curves? Okay, I'm going to keep going because I only have 2 slides to finish off, and then we can call it a day for today rather than taking a few minutes break. Okay, if that's all right with everybody. And I know, Kayla, you're going to have to leave in a minute, so you won't miss very much. Please jump in and watch the recording and catch up whatever you do.
Okay, that sounds good. Thank you.
Okay. So let's go to the other end of the lifespan then and look at older adults, all right? So we can often see older adults change in size, all right? The tissues are aging, you know, they've kind of done their work for 60, 70 years and they're starting to regress. We see quite a big change in height. You guys will be able to see this with your grandparents if they're still alive, and you get to spend time with them over time, right? You go see grandma and she's kind of the same height as you, and then you go back and see her maybe 4 months later and she's starting, and just gradually over time, grandma suddenly ends up down here, right? So height is relatively stable in adulthood, as I said, unless there's been some form of delay for some reason. But we see a decrease in older adults, right? So what happens there, we don't see, so just to make this clear, the change in height has nothing to do with leg length. All the change in height happens in the trunk. Right? Your legs can't change length. Okay, so what happens is this compression of the cartilage and other connective tissues in the spine. You see a decrease in trunk length. And if they have developed osteopenia or osteoporosis, then you sometimes see a very dramatic change because if the bone is crumbling and it gives way, it just collapses, then there's a very sudden change. When we look at weight, as I said, weight should be stable, but it isn't because of our lifestyles. So typically the average adult will start to gain weight in their 20s, particularly once they've left college, they go to work. You know, I was used to training every day when I was at college because I had time. Now I go to work and there's no time in the day to fit in a run or a walk or get to the gym. And then I start, you know, going out for business lunches or having lunch with colleagues in the office, and I start eating a little bit more, and those two things completely send your weight out the whack, right? Also, if I'm not doing my exercise, I see a loss of muscle mass and more fat deposit, right? So it's really lifestyle that dictates what's going on with the weight, unless we're talking seniors, because in seniors we see a loss of muscle mass. Even at my age, it's getting harder and harder. So once you hit 50, it gets harder and harder to maintain muscle mass. Once you hit 70, it's pretty dramatic. Even if you go to the gym every day, right? It's pretty dramatic. So as we age, then the external variables are starting to have more of an influence over what's going on with my weight. Okay? So does this have to happen? That's what we want to know. Do I have to put on weight, right? Do I have to lose muscle mass? Do I have to put on fat mass? Okay, and the fly-in isn't working because this is within the collaborate. So it's interesting to look at the elderly and senior citizens, because with luck, we're all heading in that direction, right? And when we look at the population as a whole, because overall health status has increased for many populations of people, then people are eating better, people have better health care, not everyone, but a lot of people. And so we're seeing a larger number of people who live past the age of 65, right? So it's possible that in another 10 years, over a quarter of the population could be 65 or older, right? So when we're young, it's difficult to worry about what's going to happen when I'm 70, right? But as you get older, you start to think, oh, what's going to happen when I'm 70 or when I'm 80, right? But we don't have a lot of research on that population, so it's quite an interesting experience to read some research on that population, because there's not a lot of it out there, although more and more people are doing it. Now, as the researchers get older, right, their perception of how interesting it is to research an older population changes somewhat, right? It becomes more interesting to find out, well, what is going to happen to me in another 20 years' time? When we're looking at our movement patterns, the expectation is just that we're going to slow down, we're going to spend more time sitting in a chair, we're not going to do so much, I'm not going to go play tennis or go to the gym. Why? Right? Why should my movement behaviors decline as I get older? Just because society expects that, really, right? Doesn't necessarily have to be the case if I maintain my activity levels all the way through my lifestyle, right? If I can find 10, 15, 20 minutes to go for a walk, right? If I can get myself to do a few press-ups and a few sit-ups every day, right? Then I can not stop, right? Because genetically and physiologically and chronologically, we're getting old, right? These tissues don't live forever. So they are starting to deteriorate. I can't stop that, but I can slow it down quite dramatically if I choose the right lifestyle, if I eat well, and if I stay physically active. Okay? So I could get into my 70s looking like this. Be pretty impressive, right? I wouldn't mind. My dad is 84. He has, well, he doesn't go to the gym at the moment because of COVID, but he has all his weights and his stationary bike set up in his garage, and he trains pretty much every day, right? Can he do what he could do 10 years ago? No. And he complains about it all the time. Can he do what he could do 20 years ago? No. Can he do what he could do 4 years ago? No. Right? But he goes and he trains every day. Right? So he's managing to maintain muscle mass. I mean, I can see him getting smaller even though he's training every day. But if he wasn't doing that, I can't imagine how shrunken he would look compared to my picture of him in my head, you know. So, interestingly, the other thing is that even if we take older individuals who have been sedentary and we give them some form of appropriate intervention and movement exercise to do, that they can see some improvements and slow down this decline, which I think is a fascinating idea, right? That I could go to my gran and say, come on, gran, we've got to at least walk down the garden path and back once a day, right? And you can't sit for 4 hours in front of the television. Every now and then you have to have 3 minutes of standing up and sitting back down and standing up and sitting back down to keep those legs strong, right? And we can make a difference. The research shows that. Even though there's not a lot of research in this population, what there is says we can change that. There's a big push right now for balance programs for the elderly, particularly people who are living in homes and things and who aren't independent, to try to keep them stronger so that they can maintain, they don't have so many falls, because falling is a big issue. Right? And that is all I have for you today. Questions? Comments? Experiences with grandparents? No? Okay. So on Thursday, remember, we're going to start chapter 9. I have office hours tomorrow if you have any questions about anything. And I'll see you tomorrow morning. No, I might see you tomorrow lunchtime. Keep an eye on Blackboard. If it's the play lecture, we may not have that play lecture because I don't think I have a specialist to give that for you. Okay? So keep an eye on Blackboard. I'll let you know. All right. Bye.